Hari, welcome. Thank you for joining me. And
Daniel, thank you very much for having me.
thank you also for sending me this book, which has been really interesting to dive into, a journey into the Bhagavad Gītā, it says. And I think I'm not quite at the destination yet, but there's certainly a lot of rich material to help me along the road. A guide to exploring timeless principles of transcendental knowledge and integrating them into your life, which is a project that I think is ongoing, certainly for me, and I suspect also for you.
It's a lifelong journey,
Yeah.
and one that we can take over and over again. So I hope that my book is a nice guide for people who want to take that journey, and is something that people will be able to refer to over and over again during the course of their lives.
I think it's really important in some ways to bring a text like the Gita to people's attention because it's a guide for living in the world, as most of us do. And there's so much attention paid, in the modern yoga scene to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, even if the only attention paid to it is very, very surface level lip service. It's still getting a lot of prominence, and it's not really talking about the approach to practice that most people have. The Gita, for all sorts of reasons, might not be, exactly lined with the average person's worldview, at least when they first come to the yoga class. But it is talking about being in the world, taking action, adjusting your actions to be in alignment with higher principles. And so from that point of view, it seems to me a really important text for people to study. And yet, whenever I bring it up, I get some pushback. And I wonder if you've experienced that too. I mean, to start with, the setting on the battlefield immediately triggers people into, I thought yoga was about non-harming. What's this war talk? So I wonder what sort of things come up when you first introduce the Gita to students.
Well, that's certainly one of the things that comes up, the fact that the conversation takes place on a battlefield, and in one sense, the Bhagavad Gita is Krishna's argument in favor of fighting. And one of the first things we learn about the ethics of yoga is ahimsa, non-harming. So how can this be a book about higher consciousness when we all think that higher consciousness means no fighting? And certainly it's triggering for people who have had a negative experience of the idea of God as someone who encourages fighting. Killing the enemies of God is a religious duty for people who subscribe to that kind of thinking about who God is and what God wants. So the ethical paradox of the Bhagavad Gita is one of the very first showstoppers. Another is the fact that, how did we get onto this battlefield in the first place? People don't know the backstory, and they feel like they're dropped into the middle of a story in progress. And you have to put on the brakes and say, wait a minute, how did we get here in the first place? Why is this the setting for the Bhagavad Gita? And then certainly in yoga studios are commerce-driven businesses. They don't want to scare away customers. And if you introduce a book that is quite clearly theological in nature, well, now you're talking about religion, and that can scare people away, and it's just a treacherous topic to bring up. So people are reluctant to do anything other than speak about the Bhagavad Gita in some historical sense of this is just one of the literary treasures of yoga that we won't really study very much. I agree with you that it's a great loss for the yoga community, because when we look at the Yoga Sutras, and we do that because it's got the word yoga in the title, if for no other reason, we're really looking at a rather thin part of the overall yoga tradition. We're looking at one of the paths of yoga that is taught in the Bhagavad Gita. And it just so happens that that's the path of yoga that Arjuna comes to realize is not right for him. he needs to have some other way of spiritualizing his experience. And so we get 4 different paths of yoga in the Bhagavad Gītā: karma yoga, the yoga of action; jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge; dhyana yoga, the yoga of meditation, which overlaps more or less with Patanjali's Yoga Sutras; and then bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. So the yoga community misses out on a much broader presentation of the Vedic yoga tradition by placing the Gita aside and focusing just on the Yoga Sutras or other texts. And as a guest teacher in yoga teacher trainings, I referred to the Bhagavad Gita constantly in the course of explaining the basics of yoga philosophy, and people would ask me, well, which edition of the Bhagavad Gita should I read? And there are many excellent translations, all of which either have something I wish they didn't have, or didn't have something I wish they did have. And I found myself recommending 3 different translations and commentaries in order to cover all the bases. And people don't want to do that kind of comparative reading. So I eventually thought, okay, the only solution is I have to write my own presentation of the Gita's teachings in order to meet what I saw as the need of yoga enthusiasts who want to go deeper into the philosophy and into the tradition.
Well, I'm certainly very familiar with that. I mean, I wrote a book myself for the same reason on teacher training programs. Everybody wanted an overview of not just one text, but all the texts and, all the historical knowledge. And I ended up, assigning university level reading lists. And obviously no one bothered to wait their way through dense PDFs with too many footnotes. So in the end, I thought, well, if I just write the summary that I would give as a presentation into a book form, then I've got something that I can recommend. And
right, the truth of yoga.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes, an excellent overview of the yoga tradition. And I'm very, very glad you wrote it for precisely that reason. It's a wonderful resource for yoga teachers and for yoga teacher trainings.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And your book, I think, also does something that mine doesn't, which is to integrate the presentation of what's in the Gita with, a course of study for how we might apply some of that knowledge in our own lives. And it seems to be split really into 3 parts: an introduction that helps you be prepared to read the Gita, and then a fairly well contextualized sort of commentarial presentation of translation of the verses, but with introductory elements to each chapter. But then you get onto the 3rd bit, which is, what do I do with all of this? And that's the interesting bit. That's where the rubber hits the road, and that's where I'd like to go in a moment. But before we get there, I think we should probably start with a few investigations of names, because obviously Bhagavad Gita has a meaning, and that's one of the reasons it puts people off. I mean, it literally is the song of the Lord. It's the word of God in that sense.
Yes.
And that's immediately triggering, as you say. And I think we should perhaps also clarify the meaning of your name so that people understand where you're coming from in presenting the information. So Hari-kirtana, would you like to translate how you understand that?
Sure. Kirtan Das is my full name. Hari is a name of Krishna indicating one who gives shelter along the path of yoga, a protector of sorts. And Kirtan is the glorification of God. We know that in the contemporary sense of kirtan, call and response, chanting of mantras, sacred sound. And Das means servant. So the translation of my name would be the servant of the chanting of the holy name of the Lord Hari, who removes all obstacles on the path of devotional yoga. Proof once again that Sanskrit is a very efficient language, because the full English translation is a lot longer than the 3 words that make up my name. So one very compact.
Well, of course, I guess there's also context coming into that because, I mean, literally, Hari is just it's a word describing a color as well as being a name of a deity, and there are ways in which it's used sometimes for other deities too. So it's, yeah, I guess, a context-specific way of presenting that understanding, and I guess that's come from your own initiation into a lineage. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about that as well, again, so that we get a feel for the perspective.
Sure. One of the things I indicated in the book is that I am representing what I heard from my teachers.
Exactly.
And that is the methodology by which the Gita is to be understood according to the Gita itself. So I wanted to make sure that my readers had a sense that I wasn't just making this up, that it wasn't just my own speculative conception of what the Gita means. When I hear yoga teachers say, what this means to me is, what I expect to hear next is just their own speculative interpretation that often has more to do with what they wish it meant, what would conform to their desires, as opposed to what the tradition has to say about the text. I did not, however, specify which exact lineage I'm coming from. And that was a conscious decision. I wanted to indicate that I'm connected to the tradition of a guru-disciple relationship and receiving knowledge through lineage. But I didn't want to get too specific about it because I'm presenting the Gita as a science as much as a theology that has a theory and an experiment you can do to test the theory. And by leaving it somewhat open, the reader will not project or have a preconceived notion of a particular point of view that I'm presenting, or make some association with that point of view. Now, for the sake of transparency to your listeners, I am initiated in the Chaitanya Vaishnava school of devotional yoga. So often we only hear about the monistic school or the Advaita Vedanta interpretation of yoga wisdom texts.
And yoga means union, and there is no God, basically. God is a
right.
stepping stone
there's
to the
Brahman,
ultimate
there's
union.
merging into the undifferentiated oneness of Brahman, or in the case of the Yoga Sutras, you are left with a bit of a cliffhanger where you are now conscious of yourself being conscious of yourself being conscious.
Detached forevermore.
Right. And that, you know, there's no object of consciousness, and there's also no transcendental object of consciousness either. So there's this kind of impersonal, lonely condition that, frankly, I don't find particularly appealing. And I think other people, when they hear this idea of losing one's individual consciousness, or becoming conscious of nothing but oneself being conscious, it doesn't sound like there's much ananda there. It doesn't sound like there should be a lot of bliss in that sort of absence of any other person with whom to have a relationship on any level. The Chaitanya Vaishnava school is a personalist school. It is connected to one of the 4 theistic Vedanta schools, particularly the one connected to Madhva. So if you want to get really technical about it, I am connected to the Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. And this is rather than a monistic Vedanta understanding, this is a theistic Vedanta understanding where there's a person, Krishna, who is uniquely qualified to occupy the position of God. Which brings us back to what you said earlier about it's the song of God. This is what God has to say. And well, golly gee whiz, do I really want to hear what God has to say? Am I going to have to obey a bunch of commandments in yoga too? That's what I went to yoga for, to avoid having to deal with the God who makes commandments, you know, that sort of thing. Commandments are conspicuous by their absence in the Bhagavad Gītā. One of the first things I find I have to do is redefine what we mean when we're talking about God and what do we mean when we're talking about religion. I go back first to the Latin etymological root of the word religion, religio, again to connect, repeat, return, ligio, like a ligament or a ligature, that which binds back to the source, that we heal a broken bone by binding it back to where it broke off from. So by redefining religion as that which reunites us with the source of our being, as opposed to a religion, that puts the whole idea of the relationship between, or the intersection between religion and yoga in a different light. And then the next step is to begin a reconceptualization of the idea of God. And I usually refer to Anselm's ontological proof for the existence of God, its shortcomings notwithstanding. It's a useful tool to think about what is the highest conception of a supreme being you can come up with. And by doing those two things, it kind of creates a safe space to discuss this intersection of yoga and religion and the potential or the possibility that the Atma and the Param Atma, the paramount Atma, the universal consciousness, can have a relationship that's a healthy relationship that takes place in the safest of all possible spaces, the place where the Supreme Person hangs out.
The heart.
Yeah. You can find your best friend sitting with you in your own heart, waiting for you to notice that he's there, and anxious to engage in a relationship of loving camaraderie as soon as you want to take a step in that direction.
I guess the question arises, what if you don't? And does that mean that the Gita is not the text for you? Or is there a way to engage with this experientially and to awaken to that sense of aliveness within without necessarily talking about Krishna as a person? I mean, Krishna consciousness is obviously a concept that starts to make it sound more experiential, but Krishna as a blue flute player starts to get a bit more tricky for people.
Yes, the first time I heard this idea that God was a little blue flute playing cowherd boy, I just thought, yeah, right. You might as well tell me that the universe was created by a school of cosmic dolphins. It sounds on par with the flying spaghetti monster.
Indeed.
And it took quite a bit of investigating the very complete, the very comprehensive philosophy that justifies thinking about God as a person with a particular personality. And particular attributes. When I was younger, I was drawn more to Zen and Taoism, and I read a lot of J. Krishnamurti, and the personal God idea really did not appeal to me. And it was one of the reasons that I put the Bhagavad Gītā aside. After I tried to read it the second time, I thought, oh, this is a book about religion. I'm not looking for religion, never mind. Now, in the Bhagavad Gītā itself, Krishna gives a list. This is what I think is the highest thing. And it's important to note that he's offering opinions. He never says, I command you to fight. You have to do this.
I don't know. I think I might have to take issue with you there. He does a couple of times use an imperative form to say kill. So I think that is clear, especially after his cosmic apparition. He basically saying get off your knees and get on with it.
Okay. So yes, good point. In the middle of the Gita, after Arjuna is already convinced, he's convinced that the right thing for him to do is to fight. But he's not ready to fight yet because he wants more information. Now he wants to go deeper into the conversation. And he asks Krishna to reveal to him what it means to be God. He says, I accept you, that you are the supreme person. And all these other sages of the past have also described you in this same way. Please show me, though, what that means. And Krishna's reply is, okay, yeah, I'll show you. You can't see it with the eyes that you have. I'm going to give you divine vision so you'll be able to see this. And he reveals to Arjuna his terrifying, mind-blowing, universal form. And the part of that form that Arjuna needs to see is the part of the universal form that kills everyone, time. And now up to this point, Arjuna and Krishna are friends, they're cousins, they have a very intimate, even casual relationship. And then Arjuna takes the position of student, disciple. He needs his friend's advice, and so he takes the humble position of, I'm going to learn from you. But when Krishna reveals his Aishvarya, his magnificence and power, the majesty of God, which up to that point he's kept hidden, Arjuna freaks out. He just loses it, realizing that he's had this very casual relationship with God. And now he sees what it means to be God. And he asks Krishna, I don't understand this one bit. Please explain this to me. Who are you? What's your mission here? And Krishna's reply is, I am time, destroyer of worlds. And I've come to destroy everyone. Even if you do nothing, everyone on this battlefield is going to die. You are not the doer here. All you have to do is fight, and you'll get the credit for it. If you walk away, you'll just look like a loser to everybody, and it won't change anything because I've already decided how this is going to go down. So, yeah, just pick yourself up, get yourself together, and go breathe fire on your foes.
I think you very handily, though, there also identified another potential pitfall, predestination. Is there any free will?
Yes, because Arjuna can choose. At the end of the Gita, Krishna tells him, okay, I've given you my opinion. I haven't commanded you to do anything. I've just told you what I think you ought to do. And, oh, by the way, I'm God, I'm omniscient, and you should probably take that into account when you evaluate my opinion, but do what you think is right. And Arjuna's reply is, I agree with what you have said. My illusion has been dispelled, and I'm going to act on the basis of your instructions. So all the way at the end of the Gita, there's this very big confirmation that we have a choice. It's not necessarily the choice of what the outcome is going to be. Throughout the Gita, we hear Krishna tell Arjuna, you have a right and an obligation to perform your duty, to act according to your dharma. You're responsible for your investment in the process, but you are not responsible for the result, nor do you have any control over it. So it's one of many both ands situations. Yes, we have free will if actions prior to current events have enough momentum in so far as karmic destiny that there's no possibility of changing it at this point, that we can't move the universe into alignment with our desires, then things are going to happen that are beyond our control. But that's not necessarily the same thing as predestination insofar as how are we going to act. So how we act, that's up to us. What happens, that's not.
It's the serenity prayer, really, isn't it? All over again in different form. The idea that we have to see the difference between what we can control and the vast amount that eludes our desires. So yeah, now, I guess the reason I'm zeroing in on. Go ahead, sorry.
There's a little exercise I do, which is write down 3 things that you have control over. Then, for each one of those things, write down 3 things you have no control over, upon which the thing you have control over depends. And we find very quickly that the amount of control we think we have and the amount of control we actually have is not the same.
Indeed. And that's, I guess, when the bigger picture story of the Mahabharata does need to come into the picture, the question of, what should be the guiding principle behind, why it's a good idea to go along with the flow of events rather than resisting them in relation to, when we talked about duty, really. It's the word dharma, and the guiding principle of everything really is that. And you spell that out quite clearly at the start of the book. But there is also the problem, obviously, that little bit of agency we have has the potential to confuse what's right with its opposite. And there is a warning about that in the last chapter of the Gita. That's the definition of, tamasic knowledge in a way. And the problem, I think, one can find with this text is that it can be used to justify the very thing that you were saying puts us off the idea of, commandment-giving gods killing in Krishna's name. The most sort of evocative example of this is the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi by somebody who said, "I did it for Krishna." He's been smiting characters who get in the way of righteousness throughout time, and here's my job of offing the man who was being a bit too concessionary to Muslims and led to the creation of Pakistan. So, get rid of him.
Yeah.
But that's also manifested in other forms. And, I'm part of an institute in Oxford that was set up by members of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness in the 1990s, after a rather tumultuous phase in which, murders were committed in the name of Krishna again. So it's particularly in the United States, I think. So it's a messy business.
Definitely a problem that infects almost all religious movements when you hit the extreme end of that religious movement and you get the influence of the mode of ignorance. When you mistake irreligion for religion, that's when you start to think, I am going to do God's work. If this person is going to hell, then I might as well expedite the process by burning them at the stake. or doing some other kind of incredibly heinous thing. And, people never engage in atrocities with such conviction and cheerfulness as when they think they are doing it on the basis of religion, when they think that they are engaged in God's work, because God has enemies, and those enemies need to be destroyed. And and certainly here in America, when you look at the most extreme end of Christian nationalism, it gets pretty scary. And we should be scared of that. And therefore, when we read the Bhagavad Gītā, we think, oh my God, another scary God that wants us to kill enemies. This is terrible. And that is one of the difficulties in navigating the Gita, because that's not what it's doing. It is not advocating for violence in the name of religion. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the contemporary concept of just war theory. Does this battle that Arjuna is being called to fight meet the criteria of a just war? Is it ethically sound for Arjuna to take up this fight? And I believe when you apply this analysis to the conditions that Arjuna finds himself in, that the battle does indeed meet the ethical standards set by contemporary just war theory. So yes, it is a problem. It is yet another showstopper that people look at the Gita and think, well, I'm not interested in hearing from a God like that. And it's requires attention in order to make people comfortable with the Gita while dealing with this ethical conundrum.
Well, I guess the biggest ethical conundrum, though, is with some of the people who've stepped in to try and present the information. Because the case I was thinking of in particular in the US, the murder of Steve Bryant, was related to him being quite active in trying to expose all manner of abuse by gurus, including child abuse, gun running, drug dealing. And so it was deemed a good idea to get rid of him in the name of the order. So that's not really Dharma. Obviously, it's got nothing to do with the Gita. It's just human frailty.
Yes.
But people putting themselves forward as teachers of the Gita, in this case from the Hari-kirtana movement, has made it very difficult for people to want to be associated with that organization publicly for some of those reasons.
I have my own reasons for living on the outer edge of that bubble. I have a relationship with the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. As far as I know, I'm still a member in good standing. There are other issues I have with it as an institution that don't really have anything to do with the particular case you brought up, because that was a loose cannon, which I believe there was a Netflix documentary or something that was
it was on Peacock, whatever it was.
Oh, Peacock.
NBC.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, whoever. It wasn't as if the institutional authorities had anything to do with this particular murder or the particular activities of this renegade guru who was thrown out of the institution and ended up doing prison time for fraud or tax evasion or something having to do with his criminal activity. And the reclamation project of the community in West Virginia that this renegade guru presided over in a very cultish way has been an ongoing repair project of the institution. The other problems, I tend to think that all religious institutions are going to face problems of abuse, of imbalances in power dynamics, corruption of one kind, human frailties of one kind or another. And it is my conviction that the devotees of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness who are trying to rectify all of its shortcomings due to those human frailties are indeed endeavoring in good faith to try to make the institution the best it can be. My biggest argument with ISKCON in North America in particular is the absence of women Diksha gurus. And
so that's gurus who are entitled to initiate other devotees, is that right?
Right. And there's no, at this moment, at the time of our conversation, there is no forward movement on fixing this problem. And that just annoys me no end. There are other issues about the evolution of ISKCON in North America that made me think there are people who are not hearing the ideas that the philosophy of Chaitanya Vaishnavism has to offer society, and I should therefore just take the initiative to participate in my Parama Guru's mission, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's mission of bringing this philosophy to Western countries, English-speaking countries, by finding a way to introduce the ideas of the Bhagavad Gītā into the marketplace of ideas, particularly in two places, the yoga community for one, but also into the growing community of people who identify as spiritual but not religious, or who have experienced religious trauma and are not going to be completely satisfied with the deconstruction of their prior faith into atheism or naturalism, but who want to know, what happened to the God who I thought loved me? What happened to the personal relationship that I thought I could have with a God who would accept me as I am, who would answer my questions, entertain all of my doubts, not be so insecure as to forbid me from asking questions? The Bhagavad Gītā is a book about answering questions and entertaining doubts and accepting us as we are and meeting us where we're at in order to facilitate the development of a relationship on a spiritual level with the source of our being. And because those people weren't hearing, because the institution, ISKCON, I felt had become more focused on catering to the Indian Hindu community rather than on the people in the West who did not grow up with Indian Hindu culture. I created a project for myself that doesn't exist in the chain of command of the institution. So I'm kind of a loose cannon myself. I just hope that I'm a more beneficial loose cannon than some of the other loose cannons that have shown up in the institution and needed to be removed. So, you know, I hope that my independent project still allows me to be a member in good standing, but from the distance that I choose to operate from.
Thank you for clarifying all that. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, it's always messy to delve into difficult history, but obviously, what matters is now, and yeah, what we do with where we are. And in some ways, that is coming back to the practical philosophy of the Bhagavad Gītā, the ultimate message. Because the thing that the Gita introduces that's so novel, I think, in early yoga history, is this flipping of everything upside down to say that sitting still and doing nothing is not an option. You can, if you want, sit in the corner, but your whole body's still acting, whether you like it or not. Unless you're really going to give up on life on Earth, then the question is, how do you act? How do you meet the moment? And in what spirit do you act? What's moving you to act? And with what motivation are you acting? And all of that comes to the fore, very clearly through almost a rejection of what we would conventionally find in texts like the Yoga Sutra, the stepping away from the worldview. In fact, the only use of that compound jnana yoga in the Bhagavad Gītā is at the start of the third chapter to say that's what the renouncers do. They just try to know. they try to know by sitting in the corner and doing nothing. That's useless. You need to do. So it's a resurrection of the idea of doing that other yogis were dismissing. And obviously there's a historical context to all of that. And I quite liked the thing you end the book with in your acknowledgement, saying, it's important not to allow historical context to, get in the way of spiritual meaning. And I think you were attributing that to Ravi Gupta, who had given you some insights on that. But do we need to keep the two separate in a way, to see spiritual meaning as something that's arising here and now, and can have a particular, divine flavor if that's what speaks to us, but that's somehow separate from the objective world of fact? Is subjective truth and objective truth separable in that way, or does one contain the other?
A really good question. I think that what the Bhagavad Gītā gives us are tools to integrate those things. So the subjective experience of spiritual consciousness is what we get from the practice of yoga. Then we take that consciousness into our engagement with the world of objective facts. And what that allows us to do is be in the world and engage with the world without being of the world or affected by the world in a negative way. It doesn't mean that we turn our feelings off or that our feelings are invalid or anything like that, but it allows us to engage with the world from a very different perspective, and what I think is a very empowered position that allows us to find our own personal purpose in the world, in what we have to offer the world in order to move the world in a positive direction, in make the world a better place, while at the same time empowering us to not lose our minds over the fact that we don't control the outcome of our efforts, that how things go in the ultimate issue is not something that we control. So a kind of peace, a kind of sustainable happiness that does not depend on external conditions is what the Bhagavad Gītā has to offer us on a personal level. And then on a social level, it gives us a sense of how a sane, functional society should be ordered, should be constructed, how a society can operate in harmony with cosmic order in order for everyone to live a life of peace and prosperity in both material and spiritual senses. And so the third part of my book is really about that. How do you integrate this? How do you make this a part of your life and see the world through the lens that the Gita gives us?
I guess so. There's another problem that arises at that moment, which is related to what we would call today caste, because the Gita's description of finding our purpose is not imbued with the same sort of freedom to choose that modern audiences like to add to that mix. It's really talking about something that we inherit. Krishna uses the language of the gunas to try and dress it up differently, but there are other references in the text that make it clear that this is something that one is born into. And in fact, the most striking line that's repeated twice, as you note in your book, about doing your own duty and not anybody else's, is replicated in the Manusmriti, where it's tied together with the fact that if you don't do that, you'll lose your caste status, you'll fall off from your jati. So it's problematic again, and I guess it raises for me the question of once more this separation of something that's empowering spiritually from the historical context, which might therefore mean saying actually what the Gita is saying here isn't very helpful and we perhaps need to reframe it. But in the third part of the book you caution against that, saying that's where our misunderstanding can creep in. So is the Gita's word infallible then?
If we assume that the Bhagavad Gita is what it says it is, the Song of God, that these are instructions coming from an omniscient supreme being, then logically we would say, well, yeah, this is infallible. However, now we have issues of translation. Well, who translated it? Who is qualified to translate the word of God accurately? We have the issue of a distinction, which is often not made, between a universal, eternal, transcontextual instruction and an instruction that applies to time, place, and circumstance that points to an eternal principle. For example, Krishna tells Arjuna he should fight. Is that an eternal, transcontextual, universal instruction? Should Arjuna always fight? Should we always be fighting? No. It's specific to the time, place, and circumstance that Arjuna finds himself in. Krishna says, you're grieving for what is unworthy of grief. The wise lament neither for the living nor the dead. So should we never grieve? No, it's a specific situation. Like, now's not the time for that. One of the things that happens off the pages of the Bhagavad Gita, which we will see in the Mahabharata or in the Bhagavad Purana, is that when the battle is over, what does Krishna do? He helps everyone grieve. One of the other meanings of my name, Hari, is the one who removes darkness from the hearts of his devotees, which is a particularly beautiful translation of the name Hari. So yes, I think that the Bhagavad Gita as a realized text is infallible. But to know the difference between a universal teaching and a specific time, place, and circumstance teaching is a very, very important aspect of understanding how it is infallible. And I think all too often that's missed. Now, getting back to your point about the caste system showstopper situation, yeah, that's a big one. As soon as you read that, it's like, oh, this is the caste system, we don't like the caste system, and I'm not going to accept a God who says caste system. It's very important to note that, and this is a nuance of the Gita that is also often missed. The qualification for identifying one's dharma in this life is the qualities you are born with and the work you're attracted to doing. In other words, your natural aptitudes and inclinations. We think that there's no social mobility in the caste system, and a person who is born into a Shudra family, the family of people who do work with their hands, whether they're artists or car mechanics or whatever, can only be an artist or a car mechanic, and it has no social mobility to do something else. This is not the case. If someone is born with a natural aptitude for spiritually enlightened intellectualism, and is endowed with a gentle, generous nature, then that's a Brahminical quality. And therefore, a person, even if they're born into a Shudra family, should be recognized as a Brahmin by virtue of their qualities in the kind of work that they are attracted to.
I mean, it's a nice idea, but there's a lot of Dharma texts that talk very specifically about why Shudras should be excluded from all sorts of things, particularly the actions of Brahmins, not least getting trained in Vedic recitation or anything else. So I think
I reject
concern.
those texts.
I don't disagree that you will. But the first chapter of the Gita, Arjuna is speaking that language when he's talking about the intermingling of castes that might ensue if the family dharma is destroyed, if war, brings everything to hell. So he's clearly aware that that concept of caste, that you're eternally stuck in this birth that you've been saddled with, and in fact, obviously, the karma kind of mentality can even suggest that's somehow your fault from a previous life. But obviously, we'll again reject that because that's not a very helpful way to think about life.
Krishna rejects it too. Krishna's response is, "Hey, you're speaking like you know what you're talking about, but guess what? You're wrong. You're thinking about this the whole wrong way." And that's one of the ways that he's not thinking right.
Okay, but then let's just come back to the reality of where we are in the Gita, which is, yes, the Gita is actually, I mean, one of the beautiful things about it is it does actually have a verse that says Shudras, women, can get liberated, so long as they stay in their lane.
Well, I don't remember the stay in their lane part in that verse.
Well, it's not in that verse, but it's implied everywhere else where you should do your duty and not one of another.
Yes, but now it brings up the question of, well, do women as a class only have one duty? And
well, in these Dharma texts, the Sri Dharma is pretty fundamentalist. It's stay at home and serve your male relatives. So.
Yes, well, that's why we reject it. It's
again, yes. No, I just wonder though, is there some point at which it's helpful to say there's a lot of stuff in the Gita that isn't helpful, and if we just park that, we don't need to have these conversations, but we can still draw on the spirit of the stuff that's wise without needing to make the Gita say something that doesn't quite say what those things we want to reject says, even though it sort of does.
I'm not a big fan of cherry picking. I'm not a big fan of tossing out the stuff that we disagree with or don't like or think doesn't add up, and only accepting the stuff that we think is right, that aligns with our own conception of things or our own values or such like that. Women are also going to show up in the different varnas or the different social categories of Brahmin, spiritually enlightened intellectual, Kshatriya, warrior or administrator, government ruler, the Vaishya, entrepreneurs, or Shudras, people who work with their hands. We find, for example, in Krishna's own marriage, the marriages in the ruling class were semi-arranged. The women got to tell their family, this is the guy I want to marry. And in some cases, their desires were subverted. In one particular case, Rukmini wanted to marry Krishna, but her older brother wanted her to marry somebody else. So she writes a letter to Krishna saying, hey, please come and kidnap me so that I can marry you instead of this other guy, which he does. And as he's driving the getaway chariot, she, being in the warrior class, is shooting the arrows at the pursuing allies of her jilted suitor. So obviously there is a natural aptitude for being a warrior princess in this pastime. So the point I'm making here is that in the Bhagavad Gītā, we don't see a verse that says women should stay in their lane, which is motherhood, family life, etc. What we do here is that women as a class have the same access and opportunity to transcendental knowledge that everybody else has, including the Brahmins and the warrior classes. And we don't need to read any more into it than that. And we can use yoga epistemology, scripture, logic, and lived experience to understand that women, just like men, show up in these 4 different natural social orders and therefore should be given protection in order to reach their full potential of whatever their natural aptitudes and inclinations are, whether it's having children and being a housewife, or running a country, or teaching transcendental knowledge, or running a business. Whatever it is they're naturally inclined to do, that's what they should be doing. And if the lane of men is to give women protection, then what that means is empowerment, making it safe for them to realize their potential as a person, irrespective of their particular gender identity.
But of course, the reality we were just discussing earlier of there being no female Diksha gurus in North America in 2024 shows that this sort of historical current continues to a certain extent.
Which is why that drives me so crazy, because
I get it. But then would it not be helpful to separate out the historical reality of ancient Indian, sort of situation from the timeless spiritual meaning that you can access through the Gita, rather than the need to try and sort of make it say what we would like it to say?
Yes. There is a definite need to see the Gita as a book of transcendental knowledge that just happens to show up in India, as opposed to a Hindu religious text, insofar as we identify Hinduism as a religion connected to a particular ethnicity, and more, although after the recent elections maybe not so, a nationality. So in North America, these teachings should be presented appropriately according to the culture that they're being imported into. And one of the things about my own Parama Guru, Srila Prabhupada, is that he understood that. He understood that in America, they do things differently. And therefore, the teachings have to be presented in a way that's suitable for a Western audience. And he made an extraordinary innovation that certainly did not exist in India. He invented something called the Brahmacharini Ashram, a place for women, single women, who were not protected by their fathers or protected by their husbands or protected by their grown-up sons, to come live in an ashram situation and learn about the theory and practice of bhakti yoga and participate in his mission of presenting these teachings to a Western audience. Prabhupada would never himself have would never have thought of himself as a feminist. But in fact, he was a very equal opportunity guru, because if anyone ever asked him, can the ladies do this? Meaning, can they open a temple? Can they be a temple president? Can they give class? Then can they become a guru? His answer was always the same. Why not?
The evangelical mindset would necessitate that, obviously. If you're trying to spread a message, then the last thing you want to do is say, you guys are excluded. You want to spread the word in that sense. And I
Yeah.
think, there's so much in the Gita that is worth spreading. I don't want to give the impression that I'm down on the text. I just think it's really important to address some of these hurdles so that, we can have open and honest conversations about what to do about them. And at the same time, the flip side of all of this, again, is that there is a strong argument in favor of even-mindedness, and also equal vision, as you emphasize towards the end of the book. There's a verse that you highlight, which has got in it again, the evidence of the caste system, talking about the guy who cooks dogs. The lowest kind of outcast should be
Right.
seen the same as the highest Brahmin. If you can see with yogic vision, there is no distinction, because there is a way in which, deep inside us, we're all made of the same stuff and
Right.
deserve equal respect. And that's a wonderful message, and that needs to be shouted from the rooftops.
No, your service to this conversation of voluntarily taking an adversarial position for the sake of driving some critical thinking about what the Bhagavad Gita has to offer and what its showstoppers are is actually really, really good, because these are the kinds of issues that really do come up for people, and they are the areas of nuance that often get overlooked or underappreciated. And so I actually really appreciate the way you've driven the conversation in order to get into these issues.
Oh, I'm glad I feel a little uncomfortable at times because I'm prodding you at something that, I also teach. I find the Gita a fascinating text, but, I would have identified myself as an atheist until relatively recently. I would certainly not call myself a devotee, though. So I've come to understand a way of relating to what it's telling me, which I find very empowering and inspiring, because of the way that the other side of the story, I think, is presented. Krishna is really teaching two yogas, as far as I see it. It's action and devotion, and the two are flip sides of the same coin. And really, in the end, it's acting in service of something bigger than oneself is the real message. I can get wholly on board with that. And then the question is, what is this thing that's bigger than myself? I don't really go the God direction, but there's certainly many higher principles that I want to align myself with. And the language of Dharma really helps me to feel into what that's about. That which sustains, that which is conducive to harmony, that which is beneficial to the maximum number of people, that which is served by doing the minimum possible harm always. And that helps me to orient my being in the world very clearly, and to remember as well that then everything I do is an offering to the greater good. Let's say, it doesn't have to be to God, but the same philosophy can be there. And the first part of the Gita, and then comes back at the end, is all about that. And then in the middle bit, Krishna says, well, if you really want to do this and get the fast track, clearly this mindset of devotion to me is superior. He says that repeatedly, and
Yes.
it will work whether or not you're very good at thinking yourself into a higher state of consciousness or meditating yourself into one. You just praise me and offer everything to me, and it's all taken care of. But this me bit is always the obstacle from my perspective, because I'm not really a believer in that sense.
And Krishna sees that too. He gives a list, I believe it shows up in the 9th chapter, where he says, I think this is the highest thing. But if if you can't do that, or if you don't want to do that, then do this. And if that's not something that you think you can aspire to or want to aspire to, do this instead. And then he steps.
I think
it
it's
down.
it's in the 12th chapter, I think, when he's actually saying,
Okay.
devotion is the best. And then he's got this sort of, if you can't
Yeah,
do this, do that.
this list, of can't do that, do this. If you don't want to do this, do that. And if my presentation of the Gita's teachings and the exercises and conversation points in the back helps someone to discover what is the highest purpose they can conceive of, that they can be of service to in their life, I will consider it a success.
And I think that's what you have done very well, because those questions at the back, the first one is about your relationship with God, but most of them are, how do you make sense of these funny sounding ancient Indian properties like the gunas. Can you see these things? How do they show up in your life? How does it help to think this way? Can you think of, some sort of real life situation in which this is illuminating in a way that makes sense to you? And those are the sorts of inquiries that we need to have, rather than what's often presented in a yoga teacher training of, here's a long list of stuff, learn the names, and then parrot them and pretend you know what they're talking about. It's, if it's not real in your own lived experience, it's just an idea.
Yeah, I don't think that approach to yoga philosophy is particularly helpful. And it has to be something you internalize. It has to be something you can apply in a practical way in your life. Your experience of going to work, walking the dog, folding the laundry, dealing with your children, all of that stuff, your relationship with your significant other, all of these teachings should apply to all of those aspects of our lived experience in order to elevate our experience in such a way as to make our lives happier, healthier, more rewarding, and deepen our appreciation for the opportunity we have in this life to be self-reflective and to move our consciousness in the highest direction that we can conceive of.
Thank you. Yeah, and in that sense, there is some agency in it, because it's what we can conceive of. If we can't imagine it and we can't sort of give ourselves over to it because we can't even visualize it, then it would just be blind faith. And as you point out repeatedly, the Gita is not asking for blind faith; it's asking for a reasonable investment, not in expectation of returns, but you're investing in a meaningful project rather than. That's a
great phrase. Reasonable investment. Yes, one's faith should be reasonable, and therefore the investment we make in practice to test the theory to see if it works, it's a gradual process that hopefully, if the experiment validates the theory, will be a snowballing process of ever increasing faith in a process that reveals knowledge, that therefore reinforces faith, that inspires practice.
Nice. Yes, indeed. And all those things actually are just the same thing in a way, because they're about relating to reality, aren't they? And knowledge and faith are not, in that sense, inimical. And faith is actually the foundation for seeking knowledge. If you have no belief that there's any point in engaging in the practice that will deliver the knowledge, why are you ever going to set out on the path?
Yes. Faith is the mandatory prerequisite for knowledge, no matter what kind of knowledge you're looking for.
Exactly. And therefore, faith doesn't necessarily have to be in the blue flute playing man, but it's got to be in something. It's got to be in something more than me. Otherwise, we're not getting anywhere with the yoga project.
Even in the most mundane thing, we have faith that when we cross the street, because we've got the walk sign, that the cars are not going to drive through the intersection. We don't know that, but we have reasonable faith. I have reasonable faith that when I'm in New York City, I can jaywalk like a pro. But when I'm in Edinburgh, I'm taking my life into my hands if I don't wait for the light to tell me it's safe to cross the street.
Especially if you don't look the other way.
Well, even if I look every way in Edinburgh, I was scared out of my mind to cross the street without having the light. Anyway.
So what's a good question to start with just before we wind down? If somebody's come into this and they've stuck with our conversation, they haven't been scared off the Bhagavad Gītā, and at the same time, they're not quite sure they're ready yet for this surrender, which is the last inquiry, or the relationship with God, which is the first. What's a way in? What sort of questions might it be helpful to ponder?
The first question for someone approaching the Bhagavad Gītā for the first time, I think, would be, what is the lens that the world has given me to look at the Bhagavad Gītā through? And the second follow-up question is that the lens that is going to reveal the message of the Bhagavad Gītā to me, or will it filter it out? My suggestion, which comes right at the get-go, right at the start of the book, is for the reader to try to look at the world through the lens that the Gita is offering, rather than look at the Gita through the lens the world is offering. Because if we look at the Gita through the lens the world offers us, we will see what the world wants us to see. If we look at the world through the Gita's lens, to the extent that we are able, we'll see the world the way the Gita sees it. And that could be potentially a very transformational experience.
Mm. And is there then, at the end of it all, this emphasis on experience? Is that more important than whether or not these things are objectively, let's say, true? Is the truth to be experienced rather than, assessed by anybody else? Is the only arbiter of what happens yourself, or is there some other objective reality that can come along and verify it for us, other than the others who have the same feeling?
You know, this relates to the hard problem of consciousness. I can't experience your consciousness, you can't experience mine. Our experience of being conscious beings is by its very nature subjective. So if you're looking for an empirical observation that will prove the truth of the Gita with evidence admissible in the court of science as we know it from the parameters of material nature, forget it. I don't think that is possible. This is a book, the truth of which is realized on a subjective level of one's own personal journey into the Gita's world. And therefore, the practice of the Gita's teachings and the integration of the Gita's teachings into your life, that's what's going to confirm the truth of them for the individual. And then beyond that, there's community. There are others who live according to these teachings, who accept these teachings in principle, who always want to learn more about them and have a deeper understanding of them. And hanging out with those kinds of people is very, very conducive to one's own spiritual advancement. But, in the Yoga Sutras, the yoga epistemology is presented in the order of perception, logic, and testimony. And I think the order has to be reversed. First, there's testimony, which has three components: your teacher, the scripture that the teacher is referring to, and sages of the past who have lived according to those teachings and accepted them as true. So that's the first thing. What did you hear from a teacher? Then, does it make sense when you think it through? Does it have internal contradictions? Is it practically applicable in all relevant circumstances? So soundness and completeness are the two components of logic. A philosophy has an obligation to make sense. And then the last thing is direct perception. What I'm hearing, does that jive with what I'm experiencing? When I act on the basis of the teaching, do I get the result that the teaching predicts? If you go through all of that and you end up with yes, then you can have reasonable faith that the teaching is true, and therefore you can act on that reasonable faith the same way you have reasonable faith that the car stopped at the red light is not going to all of a sudden accelerate through the intersection and run you over.
No, thank you. And I feel moved, though, nonetheless, to point out that that's obviously, an older idea that's come really from the earliest Upanishad, this idea of hearing and then reflection and weighing up and then ultimately trying to bring into a realized awareness. And that's also what Shankara emphasizes in his monistic presentation of ideas. So it's not just exclusive to the Gita, and other flavors of worldview are available that go through the same process. But in the end, what counts is putting it to the test in our own experience. So it has to be persuasive. There have to be others who've clearly found benefit from it. And then only through our deep engagement with it can we really decide if it's working for us. But, in the end, I think that's all I really wanted to get to. There's many paths, and they might even lead to different places in the end, but they might have something similar going on in them. It's not necessarily that, the existence of a worldview involving God is somehow operating with a different epistemological framework. It's actually assessing experience in the same way, and it's drawing knowledge from very similar places originally, because a lot of the Gita has come out of the Upanishads too, but it's got a slightly different experiential tone to it, and it's more alive in a different way. I mean, Shankara is pretty renunciate, isn't he? And it's for the dry, transcenders of thinking rather than the singing and the dancing, and I think that's what the Gita lends itself to more, and so it's very much of the world, and that's its great gift. Is there anything else you wanted to? Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, just that in Bhakti Yoga specifically, the first four processes are hearing, chanting, serving, and remembering. So we hear, if we like what we hear, then we repeat what we hear, and we engage in part of the process of svadhyaya, which is mantra meditation. So chanting involves not just like mindfulness meditation or something like that, but a meditation through sound on your Ishta Devata, the particular form of the absolute truth that you feel some affinity towards. Then remembering is next. So you take your meditation out into the world with you, and that results in service to something higher than yourself. And like we said earlier, what that highest conception of that thing or person that is greater than ourselves that we feel inspired to serve, that'll be different for different people. And the Gita has something to say and something of value to offer for anyone who wants to find meaning in their lives by serving something greater than themselves.
That's a lovely place to end it. But I do feel moved to ask, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we haven't had a chance to? Because I know I've steered the conversation quite a bit, and I just want to give you a bit of space if there's anything you'd like to add.
That's your job. You're the podcast host.
Yeah, sure. But you wrote a book, so if you...
Well, I think you did a great job of driving the conversation into all kinds of really, really interesting places. I hope it has stirred interest in my book. And I have a website people can visit. I have an Instagram page that hopefully has something of value as well. So I hope our conversation has generated a little bit of interest in what I'm trying to offer to the conversation about yoga in the yoga community and the ways in which we can navigate the intersection of yoga and theology. Other than that, I can't really think of any burning topic that I've been just sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for you to give me a chance to talk about. So I think we're good.
No, cool. Well, it's all about, how we relate to reality, and here we are doing that. So I really appreciate your willingness to just go there and dive in the deep end and, talk about very worldly dimensions to what is ultimately, a very spiritual text.
Well, this is my idea of a good time.
Great. Let's nerd out again sometime then.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hari.